And we are now live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 8 on our 26 chapter series. And today we're going to be covering the time period that includes the administrations of Jefferson and Madison from 1801 until 1817. And so, if you want to follow along on our website is www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. And this is chapter 8 of the compendium. So if you go to Founding Era, this chapter is called Republican Liberty. And so this chapter is divided into two sections. The first section is called The Sage of Monticello, 1801, 1809, and this covers the administration of Jefferson. And then the second section in this chapter is called His Little Majesty, which is a reference to James Madison. And this covers the two terms of the Madison administration. And so each section has its own dedicated timeline, like what you see here. And each of the timelines on the compendium include many primary source documents, but also events to give context to what happened during these time periods. And so let's look at the Jefferson administration. We begin with Jefferson's inaugural address on March 4th, 1801. And if you want to read these primary source documents under the title of each one, sometimes there's a description, and I'll be adding more descriptions to all these documents, is a link that will take you to the full text of the primary source document. One of the first things that Jefferson does is he will begin pardoning those convicted under the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act was passed by John Adams because of the quasi-war happening with France, and Jefferson, along with Madison, interestingly enough, will be the authors of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions protesting the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so once Jefferson becomes president, he starts to pardon people who were arrested under the Sedition Act. During this time, Tripoli, a North African kingdom of mostly pirates, will declare a war on the United States. Jefferson will send warships to Tripoli because he did not negotiate with terrorists. Jefferson holds first public reception at the White House. The White House had only just become the residence for the president under the Adams administration. So the White House is still brand new. Jefferson gives his 1801 State of the Union address around the same time as the Convention of 1800. This is a peace talks between France and the United States. And at this time, France is being ruled by the first consul, Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is before he became emperor of France, but after he took power over the government of France. Jefferson will write a letter to a Baptist church, and in it, he will argue that the First Amendment, especially the Establishment Clause, the very first clause of the First Amendment, established a wall of separation between church and state. And so the Danbury Baptist Church, they send a letter to Jefferson on talking about the issue of religion, and then Jefferson responds with this letter talking about a wall of separation between church and state. The Library of Congress is established under the Jefferson administration. The Act to Protect Trade in the Mediterranean. This is to provide the United States with more legitimacy regarding sending warships to the Mediterranean. you have the first, or not the first, but you have an early repeal of the Judiciary Act, which was one of the last things that John Adams signed right before he left office. Jefferson, during his administration regarding the military, he was very much against having a standing army. And so during his time, the size of the military, which is already incredibly small, will, especially for the federal government, will be decreased, which is not a good thing for the United States at this time. And during the Madison administration, you'll understand why decreasing the military was not a good thing. You have the repeal of the internal taxes. So you have some internal taxes that are passed during the Washington and Adams administrations, and Jefferson is against these internal taxes, taxes on property especially, and so he will, or Congress at this time, will repeal them. You have the Naturalization Act of 1802, which expanded the number of people who can migrate. You have the first Naturalization Act, first couple Naturalization Acts, which are very restrictive of who can come to the country. Pretty much only British people, people from England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, are really, and like northwestern France are like the only people who can come to the country and be naturalized as U.S. citizens. Anyone can come to the country. There's not a strong border. The concept of a strong border wasn't, at least in the United States, because of the massive frontier. Um, the concept of a strong border was not really present, but they could more easily regulate naturalization, who is and is not a U.S. citizen with the right to vote and the right to hold office. You have the Judiciary Act of 1802, which replaced the Judiciary Act of 1801. You have the Convention for Indemnification, which concerns foreign affairs. Thomas Paine, he will return to the United States after spending some time, about a decade, in France for the French Revolution. The French Revolution is now over, as Napoleon is the first consul of Rome, and in a couple years, Napoleon will crown himself the first emperor of Rome. So the revolution is over, and it's now under a military dictatorship. And so Thomas Paine, being against military dictatorships, will flee France, go back to the United States, and will continue writing political essays about the United States. And so here are a couple political essays that he writes. Jefferson's 1802 State of the Union Address, Message from Congress on Native Relations. And so this will begin a conversation of the presidents talking about removing Native Americans. Indian removal doesn't really pick up support until John Quincy Adams' administration. And then following John Quincy Adams' administration, you have the Jackson and Buren administrations, which will actually implement Indian removal. And so, but these are the early messages from the president to Congress about specifically Native relations. You have the very famous Marbury versus Madison case. And this case is decided by Chief Justice Marshall, the longest serving Chief Justice. Longest serving Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he will interpret the Constitution as giving the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, the power of judicial review. That is, the power to decide on the constitutionality of the law. And so, under our system of government, which is very different from most of the world, we have the Constitution, and then we have the law, which is under the Constitution. Unlike in places like England, where the law is the Constitution. Parliament can pass any law, and that will have the same effect as changing the Constitution of England. So in England, there are no unconstitutional laws because Parliament can just change the law and thereby change the Constitution. In fact, this is one of the arguments made by members of Parliament and by loyalists during the lead up to the American Revolution, where they'll say, they're just saying that Parliament can change the Constitution, while the American colonists will argue that, the Constitution is superior to the law, and you cannot just easily change it and violate our rights as British subjects. Because there were laws in Parliament passed by previous kings recognizing the rights of Englishmen in the colonies. But the new new Parliament leading up to the American Revolution will argue that, so what? So what if there was a law 100 years prior recognizing and respecting the rights of Englishmen in the colonies? We're revoking that law, and we can do that. We have the prerogative to do that, and you can't stop us because you don't have any representation in Parliament to vote against this. And so Parliament will argue that they have a right to change the Constitution by simply passing new laws that revoke old laws, while the American colonists will argue that the Constitution is above and beyond the law, and in fact, there could be unconstitutional laws. And this difference in understanding state structure and the purpose and function of constitutions was birthed from the fact that the colonies had their own charters. Charters acted as constitutions. And although the colony, the colonial legislature, can easily change the laws within the colony, it could not change the charter, the Constitution, how the colony was organized, the branches of government, the rights of the people. These things were above the everyday laws passed by the colonies. And so the development of this separation between the Constitution and the law begins, at least functionally, in the American colonies. And so when people say which foreign country had the greatest influence on the development and the ideas of the American Revolution, it's none of them. It's none of the foreign countries. It's not ancient Rome. It's not ancient Greece. It's not Britain, crying out loud. It's the colonies themselves, the colonies and how they evolved, how they developed from their founding until the Revolution. That was the greatest influence on the American Revolution when it comes to the structure of government that they believed in. And their anti-aristocratic, anti-monarchical, and anti-state religion views come from not only the development of the colonies, which are in constant conflict with the Church of England, and the Church of England, the Anglican Church, was trying to enforce its own theocracy onto the colonies, this made many colonists opposed to mixing church and the state and wanted more individual, more local freedoms, more akin to the communal customs of the old common land of England and how those communities, which are centered around the church, so it's not an atheist society, it is still a religious society, but without a religious state. That is to say, a state that is not actively cooperating with a church institution to enforce or to even promote religion. Many of the founders will be against establishing not just a state religion for the nation. In fact, most of them are against that. But even most of them are against establishing a church within their individual states. Virginia is notable for not establishing a church during this time, and it's because of people like James Madison, who will give this amazing speech to the Virginia legislature when the Virginia legislature was debating whether or not to adopt a church religion for the state. That was proposed by Patrick Henry. So Patrick Henry was in favor of church, state, and church combination, specifically a tax that will raise revenue to pay for establishing churches and promoting church education in schools. And schools at this point are basically just sermons or seminaries. And people like James Madison and most of the Virginians in the Virginia state legislature will oppose this bill to establish the Protestant church in Virginia, and also to not establish a tax to help pay for the church and the church education and religious education. James Madison will give a speech called Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments, and he gives a bunch of reasons why this is a terrible idea. And I think many of those reasons still apply today. And so I encourage you to look at that. That was in the chapter called More Perfect Union, and in a section called Prolusion. This is the prelude to the Philadelphia Convention to establish the Constitution. So Marbury versus Madison establishes judicial review, and there's some debate on whether or not judicial review is even part of the original Constitution. I mean, it's not in the text of the Constitution, and I think it should be in the text. It should be enumerated. However, if you're an originalist, then you should argue that judicial review is part of the original Constitution, because if you read the Philadelphia Convention Journal and notes by James Madison and other delegates who were there who wrote notes, when they debate having a judicial branch, they also included a discussion, at least briefly, on judicial review, on whether or not the judicial branch has, especially the Supreme Court, has a right to determine the laws of Congress as unconstitutional. And although it's kind of hard to parse the original intent simply because not every founder agreed on these, so if one founder says that they believe the inherent power of the Supreme Court is judicial review, and then you have another founder who says that no, the Supreme Court does not have the inherent power of judicial review, then which is the original intent of the Constitution? Is it the one side or the other? And especially if the Constitution doesn't actually put it down and doesn't enumerate it into the text. Does the fact that it's not enumerated into the text mean that it wasn't part of the original intent? Or is the original intent an implied power of the Supreme Court? I'm still trying to figure this out and trying to figure out how we should judge the different types. Well, first of all, how can we prove original intent if not through the text? And if there was a power that people believed in and believed that was inherent to the office or the Supreme Court, why wouldn't they add it to the text? Why wouldn't they enumerate that power, especially our founding fathers, who were obsessed with writing down all the powers that the government ought to be granted, and saying that any powers not granted to the government are powers not, or any powers not enumerated into the Constitution is a power not granted to the government. So, it's this issue of implied powers. What do we imply, and what is limited by the text? And so I'm more of a textualist than an originalist. And since judicial review is not in the text of the Constitution, I do not believe that judicial review is a power of the Supreme Court. Now, I personally believe that the Supreme Court should have the power of judicial review. I just don't believe that the Constitution says that it does, simply because the Constitution does not say that it does. I want it to say that it does, and the only way to do that is to amend the Constitution in order to finally grant, as an enumerated power, grant the Supreme Court the power of judicial review. So, enough about the Supreme Court and Marbury v. Madison. Let's move on. Ohio becomes the 17th state in 1803. And also in 1803, we have the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, which will be the United States under Thomas Jefferson buying, basically doubling the size of the United States with the Louisiana Territory, which was owned by the French. And France is under the reign of Napoleon right now. At least the first consul of France. And Napoleon, he needs to raise money quickly in order to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. So that's why he sells the Louisiana Territory. Also, the fact that most of the Louisiana Territory is farmland in order to feed the slave population of the French colonies in the Mediterranean, and not the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, like in Haiti. And the Haitian Revolution just happened. I have to add that to the timeline. But the Haitian Revolution has just happened, and the French lose that colony after a bloody revolution. And they will, that was the main source of revenue for the French in the New World, sugar plantations. And so because they lost the sugar plantations, which was the whole point of having the farmland in Louisiana Territory, was to provide food for the slaves on Haiti, the French decided to just give up the Louisiana Territory to raise cash fast. Let's see, Thomas Jefferson will go to Congress talking about or proposing the Lewis and Clark expedition, which will be begun the next year. Samuel Adams, he died in Boston, and he was a central agitator for independence and later helped to guide Massachusetts through the early republic. And so Samuel Adams is a very important founder, although he loses his fame during this time because he opposed the Constitution. And everyone ended up, well, not everyone, but most people ended up supporting the Constitution, and so he lost his fame during that debate. Jefferson will give us 1803 State of the Union address. The 12th Amendment will be submitted to the states for ratification. Message to Congress on the wreck of the USS Philadelphia in Tripoli. So fighting in Tripoli is still going on. Now we have the Lewis and Clark expedition. They begin in St. Louis, and they will walk well, not walk, but they'll ride on boats and horseback. And it wasn't just Lewis and Clark. They had a very large entourage of people to protect them. And then, of course, they had Sacagawea as a helpful native guide. And they will go all the way up the Missouri River and continue this way through Yellowstone and then the Snake River all the way and connecting to the Columbia River, which is this river here, all the way and make it to the Pacific Ocean. And then they'll return. They will split up to see if there is a faster path. And then they'll meet again at Fort Mondon. And then make it all the way back to St. Louis. So all this territory, and even down below this, is the Louisiana Purchase. And this is Oregon country, which will be claimed by both the United States and Britain, the British territory here. And then the Spanish, they still have territory over here. The 12th Amendment is ratified on June 15th, 1804. And then Hamilton has his famous duel with Burr. And Hamilton dies the next day. And Burr will run away and pretty much go crazy. And he'll first go to Massachusetts to start a secession movement. And then he'll go to the frontier to try to claim his own colony. And then he tries to go to Mexico to take over Mexico by himself, and then give Mexico over to the United States. He just absolutely goes crazy after the duel. And so you have the election of Jefferson. Jefferson beats Pinckney. Jefferson give his 1804 State of the Union address. Forgot to mention, for Thomas Jefferson, he believes that the president giving the State of the Union addresses in person was too monarchical, because it's reminiscent of the British king giving his Kingdom of the or State of the Kingdom address, if you can call it that, in Parliament, where every single year the king will address Parliament about the issues of the kingdom. And so Thomas Jefferson, being an anti-monarchist, is going to be opposed to delivering the State of the Union address in person to Congress. And so he will write the State of the Union addresses and send the writing of them to Congress. And that's how we have these images of the actual handwriting of Thomas Jefferson writing these State of the Union addresses, because he did not give them in person. Jefferson is inaugurated for the second time on March 4th, 1805. The U.S. Marines capture the capital of Tripoli. Soon after, we make peace with Tripoli, and Britain starts to seize neutral American ships, because, again, this is during the Napoleonic Wars. Jefferson's 1805 State of the Union address. And I'll be adding more to the timeline. I'll be adding a lot about, the Haitian Revolution and then also the Napoleonic Wars, so that we can keep up with what's going on in Europe, because it does have an impact on what happens in the United States. The Non-Importation Act on British goods due to impressment. So this is an embargo on the British because of the impressment of U.S. sailors and the stealing of U.S. boats. Let's see, Constitutions, Governments, and Charters by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, he's still writing a bunch of these political essays, and I love all of them, so please check them out. You have another expedition by someone less known than Lewis and Clark called Zebulon Pike, and he will travel from St. Louis, so the same starting point, and he will go south, and so he will explore much of the Southwest, as opposed to Jefferson and Madison exploring much of the Northwest. Challenge to the Federalists to declare their principles by Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine, he's more of a Republican right now, and he is going to be pretty much attacking the Federalists as much as possible. And the Federalists, they're not doing a very good job right now maintaining their position, and they'll do even worse when the War of 1812 happens, because they're going to be very pro-British, and so when war with Britain happens, they're going to lose all their support, and the Federalist Party will dissolve, and a new party will emerge from the ashes of the Federalist Party, and that is going to be the Whig Party. You have this, The Liberty of the Press by Thomas Paine, another political essay. Jefferson's 1806 State of the Union Address. Jefferson will deliver a special message to Congress about Burr going crazy, Aaron Burr, the guy who killed Hamilton. You have the Judiciary Act of 1807, an act prohibiting the slave trade, which goes into effect 1801 and January 1st, 1808, but it's passed March 2nd, 1807. And so this, again, is very interesting because most people believe that they should protect, most people assume that a pro-slavery nation would want to protect the slave trade in order to keep the supply of slaves, but also not let the price of slaves go down, or not let the price of slaves go too far up to where only the rich can have slaves. If you have a pro-slavery country, they would want as many people to have slaves, so then as many people will have the interest of preserving the institution of slavery. But this will have the opposite effect, where fewer people can afford to have slaves, and although fewer people have slaves, those few people will have more slaves. And so, because fewer people have slaves, fewer people have the interest of maintaining slavery, which eventually led to the abolition of slavery, along with other reasons. But I always find that as an interesting part of the topic. Let's see, an act using the military to suppress insurrection. So I'll have to do more research into this. The Leopard incident, Leopard incident. British ship fires upon an American ship in the Chesapeake Bay. Burr is not found guilty on treason charges. A proclamation of pardon to military deserters. Jefferson's 1807 State of the Union Address. Britain declares order in council forbidding nations from trading with France. And then Napoleon will issue the Milan Decree forbidding nations from trading with England. And so Jefferson will respond by passing the Embargo Act, which doesn't trade with France or England. An act prohibiting the slave trade goes into effect. Second Embargo Act. Napoleon issues the Bayonne Decree declaring American ships trading anywhere in Europe are violating the Milan Decree. Proclamation against insurrection near Lake Champlain. Then you have the election of James Madison, November of 1808. Jefferson will give his last State of the Union address, November of 1808. And again, this is written, not spoken address. Enforcement of the Act of the Embargo. You have the Macon Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act, which is the Non-Trading Act. Again, expanding the embargo on France and Britain. And this leads into the Madison administration. And so Madison will inherit the embargoes of Jefferson, which will prove economically disastrous, and the geopolitical situation between the United States and especially Great Britain and France, which will have a major impact, negative impact, during the second term of the Madison administration. So David Erskine is the British minister and met with Madison to offer the repeal of the Orders of Council and open trade. And so Madison, early on, tries to negotiate opening trade between the United States and Britain, and this will actually lead to war with Britain. And so Madison will make a proclamation on the Erskine Agreement, where he is told that, by Erskine, that Parliament will lift the trading restrictions of the Orders of Council. And so Madison will give an address to Congress on the renewed trade with Britain, which he is very happy about. And then the British Foreign Secretary, George Canning, recalls Erskine. Canning rejects the deal to continue trade with America. And so Madison will receive notice that the Erskine deal is void, and he will immediately make a proclamation to Congress to renew the prohibition on British trade. So, because of the British, open trade is not happening. America, James Madison, he wanted open trade. He was so excited for having open trade, and the British just pull that right up from under him, and he gets pissed. And he will give his State of the Union address in 1809, and then he will also give an address to Congress on strengthening the militia to guard against the Spanish. So even all the way back here, the Spanish will become a problem for the United States on the frontier and then also in the Caribbean. You have Fletcher v. Peck, another famous Supreme Court decision. You have the Macon Act, second one. Here is the 1810 census. Now here's a video by Jeffrey the Librarian. So check out his channel and subscribe and watch his videos. He has a bunch of videos on history, and he's been doing a series on each of the censuses, and he has given me permission to use his videos on this timeline. Madison's proclamation on the occupation of West Florida. And so the United States will be fighting the Spanish on the frontier, and the frontier at this time is Florida with Spanish. Madison Proclamation on the Macon Act. Madison 1810 State of the Union Address. Veto Act on incorporating the Alexandria Protestant Episcopal Church. And so a bill goes through Congress trying to establish a church in D.C. At this point, Alexandria is part of D.C. Only later will Virginia take back the land that it granted to the District of Columbia. I think that original land should be given back to D.C. That's just my opinion. And so Alexandria is in D.C. at this point, and they try to incorporate a church, an Episcopal church, and Madison will veto it. And so I have Madison's veto message against establishing a church religion, or a state religion, in D.C., which is federal territory. Madison's veto on aid to religious establishments, which follows his veto of the of incorporating the Episcopal Church. Madison will call for an extra session of Congress in order to deliver his war message address. And the Battle of Tippecanoe happens on November 7th, 1811. And so a number of presidents, but the future Tippecanoe, which is William Henry Harrison, will gain fame from this battle. That's why he's nicknamed Tippecanoe. Madison's message to Congress on the Battle of Tippecanoe, an act to raise military forces, the Constitution of Louisiana of 1812, proclamation of pardons to deserters, Madison's message to Congress on the American ships being sunk by the French. So even though the quasi-war is over, the French are still sinking ships based on the Bayonne Decree. And so you have the embargo of 1812, which will continue and expand the embargo on the French and the British. The admission of Louisiana as a state, renominated by the Republican Party caucus for president. That's Madison. And then Madison finally gives his war message to Congress. This is the very first war message to the Senate, specifically, in order to declare war on a foreign country that is not a native tribe. And so Britain, the country that we fought to gain our independence, will be the very first country that will fight in a all-out war. Of course, here's an engraving of the time period, and this is not exactly how the war will go. British orders in council suspended, which prevented neutral ships from trading with France. So it's very ironic that James Madison will give his war message to Congress over the issue of trading with Britain and the orders of council, and then only right after does Britain suspend the orders in council, which is the whole point for, and it still takes time for news to travel, and so Congress votes for war over trade, which the British open back up as they're declaring war. So the fact that news takes a lot of time to travel becomes very detrimental during this time period. And so Madison will proclaim a state of war, and you have the very first battle, or one of the first battles, which is the USS Constitution versus HMS Guerriere, and this is a U.S. victory. And so, if you know anything about the British, if the United States beats Britain on the ocean, that's a declaration of war, outright. And so, Britain will go to war with the United States. Proclamation of pardon of deserters. So deserting is a very common thing at this time. Deserting when it comes to fighting Native Americans, deserting when it comes to the frontier, deserting when it comes to fighting the um, now the British and also the French. You have the election of Madison, and so this is before any actual British victories, and so Madison's popularity is pretty high at this point. So he beats Clinton. Madison's 1812 State of the Union address, and veto on naturalizing immigrants. Madison will give his second inaugural address on March 4th, 1813, and he will deliver a message to Congress on how the war is going. And again, there hasn't been that many battles. And you have the Battle of the Thames, which is a U.S. victory against the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. He dies, and that will break up the Native Alliance. So this is one of the last battles of the Northwest War against Native chiefs like Tecumseh. Madison's 1813 State of the Union address. Madison calls for a total embargo on all British goods, which will become the embargo of 1813. And then Congress receives an officer to negotiate peace from Britain. Madison's message to Congress on Britain's offer of peace. You have the Battle of Cahokia. I'm really bad with these names. General Jackson leads the U.S. victory and native against enemy natives. And then Madison calls for the repeal of the embargo on neutral nations. British will surprise attack Washington, D.C. They will sack and burn the most of the city, including the White House, which is the background image that you see here. And Madison will call forth the defense of D.C. with the militia. You have the Battle of Lake Champlain against the British, which is a U.S. Navy victory in the lakes. Francis Scott Key sees the flag the flag is still there at Fort McHenry. Madison's 1812 State of the Union address, while the height of the war is going on. Massachusetts resolution calling for New England states to gather their resentments of the federal government. So Massachusetts and other New England states are going to be very angry about the War of 1812, about all the embargoes and trade restrictions and fighting, and then also frontier. And so they will send a list of grievances to the federal government. And there's actually a secessionist movement in the North. And it doesn't pick up, it does pick up a lot of support, but obviously not enough to do anything. And it won't be until the sectional crisis, and especially the election of 1860, so 40 plus years after this, where the South will claim to have a right to secede. But that's ahead of where we're at right now. And that convention that I mentioned of the New England states is called the Hartford Convention. And they will pass the Hartford Convention Resolves, which will be a list of grievances from New England states. And you have the Battle of New Orleans, despite peace being, or at least the cessation of fighting was already made. So even Madison will veto the National Bank Bill. Congress purchases Jefferson's library to rebuild the Library of Congress after it got burnt. And now you have the Treaty of Ghent, which is the official excuse me, which is the official peace treaty between the United States and Britain. And then you have Madison's war message to Congress on Algiers, and the Senate will declare war on Algiers. So right after the War of 1812 is over, we go to war with another country over piracy in the Mediterranean, and also enslaving Americans, which Algiers was doing. Madison's 1815 State of the Union address. The Senate ratifies peace with Algiers. They will charter the Second Bank of the United States after the first bank was expired. Tariff of 1816. Election of Monroe. Monroe beats Rufus King. Madison's 1816 State of the Union address. The admission of Indiana as the 18th state. The American Colonization Society is established, which sought to resettle free black Americans in Africa, arguing that this would resolve tensions between races and gradually end slavery without disrupting white society. Its founders included prominent figures such as Henry Clay, Bushrod Washington, and Francis Scott Key, who viewed colonization as a humanitarian and social compromise, though many abolitionists and free black leaders condemned it as racist and coercive. The society established the colony of Liberia in 1822, but despite relocating several thousand people, it ultimately failed to gain wide support, as most black Americans rejected exile from their homeland, and most whites refused to fund or prioritize the project. You have the territory of Alabama, which is being established, and now you have the veto of the bonus bill to veterans. And so that will conclude this chapter and this live stream. This has been Chapter 8, Republican Liberty, 1801 to 1817, and this covers the presidential administrations of Jefferson and Madison. And so you see a lot of things are going on. One, the United States doubles its territory with the Louisiana Purchase. It will continue fighting Native Americans, especially in the Northwest Territory, around the Great Lakes region, or the Northwest Territory of that time, which will become part of the Northeast, or the North Central of the United States. You have the embargo issue with Britain and France, which will lead to the War of 1812, burning of the White House and many buildings in D.C., and that eventually gets resolved and peace is restored, and that will lead into the next chapter, Chapter 9, which is called Good Feelings, and covers the administrations of James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, but we'll talk about that on tomorrow's live stream. So I hope you enjoyed today's live stream. I hope that you learned something new of our old history. And again, this is all still a work in progress. So there are many more events, many more documents, and many more changes that that I'll be adding to these timelines. This is still a work in progress. If you want to share or provide some support, we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3, so all donations are tax deductible. You can donate a small amount frequently, or you can donate a larger amount. You can sponsor an era and get your name at the bottom of these chapter pages. And so it's $100 per era that if you want to sponsor. If you want to give a large one-time donation, or it's $100 a month to get your name on here. to be a sponsor of an era. And sponsoring us helps us uh, with retrieving these archival materials online. Some archives require us to pay them to get access, like a license to actually use these, at least the images of the documents that they hold in their archive. And so sponsoring us helps pay for our expenses when it comes to doing this research. And you can see how your era will improve as we add more documents and events to it. And so if you're interested in giving a larger one-time donation, then you can email me at mark with a K at tarpeia, TARPEIA .us, mark at tarpeia.us, and I'll send you more information about our charity, like our EIN and our address, for you to send your large contribution. If you just want to do smaller monthly contributions, you can do so on our website, on our donate page. But if you want to give a larger donation and not have it go through the website, then ship us or mail us the check, then you can just email me at mark@tarpeia.us, and I will send you our address and EIN. So thank you all for watching. I hope this has been illuminating for you, and I hope this encourages you to do more research into the time period and of these administrations. And I hope to see you tomorrow for tomorrow's live stream covering the Good Feelings chapter. So thank you, and